Carter color, make it perfect. Carter color, make it perfect.
The events that we will talk about today takes place during the so-called New Kingdom. So ancient Egypt is usually divided into the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom, with various intermediate periods in between. The so-called New Kingdom took place from around the 16th to the 11th centuries BC. And in particular, what we will focus on today is a period in which the 18th dynasty of Egypt ruled from the capital called Thebes. This is like basically at the height of ancient Egyptian civilization. It was a time when the empire was at its largest in terms of size and also most powerful in terms of politics and culture and so on. It was a time of huge flourishing for Egypt. The pharaoh who ruled this vast empire went by the name Amenhotep III, then ruled roughly between 1386 to 1349 BC. The religious reform that is the subject of this video wouldn't be instigated until the time of his son, but Amenhotep III still serves as a great kind of introduction and prologue to the events that will happen later. You see, during the rule of this great pharaoh, all the other gods, the usual gods, were still worshipped as usual, but it seems that the sun god in particular had been given an unusually exalted and important position during his reign. The sun was the god of gods, was the creator of all the other gods, and all of creation depended on the sun, on its rising each morning. As was customary, the sun god was worshipped under many different names and forms, and the most prominent was of course Amun and Ra, or Amun Ra, or also Ra Horakti as his name was, and the most common way to depict the sun god was, as I said, as a falcon with a sun disk on his head. Another common name to refer to the sun, or specifically to the disk of the sun itself, was the name Aten, a form of depiction and name which had become increasingly popular at the time of Amenhotep III, and we will return to this pretty soon. What is significant about Amenhotep III and his reign, at least in terms of religion, is the very strong focus that was placed on the sun god in particular, what scholars have come to call the New Solar Theology. But what's also interesting is that by the end of his reign, Amenhotep may have started to identify himself with the sun god. Now, the pharaohs were always seen as divine in some way and as being the sons of Ra, but Amenhotep III seems to have taken this relationship even further. He identified himself as the sun god in a more direct way, you could say. Egyptologist Raymond Johnson, among others, have argued that Amenhotep III was indeed deified to an unusual degree in the last years of his reign, identifying himself with the sun god and being referred to unambiguously as, quote, the dazzling Aten. So in any case, Amenhotep III isn't the main character of our story today. He dies around the year 1349 BC and is succeeded by his son, the new pharaoh, with the very creative name Amenhotep IV. And he would instigate a complete reform of the Egyptian religious, artistic, and literary world, and would be responsible for one of the most dramatic religious revolutions in all of history. This new pharaoh, Amenhotep IV, immediately shows a clear favoritism towards the sun god, and in particular in the form of Aten, the sun disk. During his early reign, he built temples to the Aten at Karnak, the great temple complex in Thebes, but the old gods still existed. It wasn't, as some have assumed, that he completely removed all other gods from existence, at least not right away. But he does showcase a clear interest in the Aten as the most exalted of all of the gods. During the first couple of years of this new pharaoh's reign, he would gradually implement some of his revolutionary ideas. The Aten, as we have seen, had been a pretty common name and form of the sun god previously, but he was given a completely new identity and role under the reign of Amenhotep IV. The Egyptologist Eric Hornung writes that, quote, "It is as though the Aten suddenly emerged from the traditional form of the sun god and then quickly shed the last vestiges of his origin." It is thought that it was around the years 3 to 5 of his reign that the new pharaoh started to seriously implement his reforms of Egyptian society, and this included a gradual but complete shift in religion, but also in art, literature, language, and administration. The Aten became more and more pronounced as the most important and exalted god, and in the new temples was starting to be depicted in a new way. Instead of the classic falcon-headed god, the Aten was now being depicted without any anthropomorphic features. Instead, he was depicted as just a sun disk with his rays shining down on earth. It was also around this time that the pharaoh decided to change his name. He was no longer to be known as Amenhotep IV, which contained the name of the god Amun, who was a lesser god according to him. Instead, he would take on a new name, which fitted better to his new religious orientation and is the name that most people would come to know him by from then on, and that name was Akhenaten. As if this wasn't enough, Akhenaten also decided to move his capital city from Thebes and instead build a whole new city in a remote location in Middle Egypt. He called the new city Ankhenaten, the horizon of the Aten. It was a city that was to be entirely dedicated to the new central god. The city was strategically surrounded by mountains and would serve as the headquarters of Akhenaten's new vision for Egypt. Ankhenaten was built with a new solar cult in mind. Everything was planned according to it. The traditional form of the temple, with an inside and a closed-off dark space or holy of holies in which the figure of the god stood, was completely replaced by temples that had no roof at all. Instead, they were open to the light of the sun, or in other words, the Aten, the god, and thus they turned the sun itself into the idol of the god, and the temple was built around the presence of the actual sun by remaining open to the sky. If you played the video game Assassin's Creed Origins, and specifically a DLC called The Curse of the Pharaohs, you can actually visit Ankhenaten in a kind of dream world. But in this game, they've actually recreated the open roof form of the temples in a very accurate way. This form of the temple, of course, made sense from a religious point of view, but in a practical sense, it wasn't maybe the greatest ideas, as many of the workers and slaves who were in the temple had to withstand incredible heat without any shade for most of the day. We even have complaints from the Assyrian king at the time, who claimed that his emissaries were left to, quote, die under the sun as they visited the pharaoh. The reason that Akhenaten decided to build a new city was probably that he wanted to be able to carry out his new reforms and religious ideas in an unhindered way. He, of course, hadn't been without his critics back in Thebes. Many of the priests of the old gods and some of the political adversaries were not very happy with him, and so one of the reasons he built this new city was to escape many of those enemies. By building a new city in a remote location, he was able to start fresh. Without temples to other gods and their priests, he could dedicate the whole city and all of his time to the Aten. For the rest of his reign, Akhenaten would rule with his family from the city Ankhenaten. Estimates show that the population of the city in general may have been between 50 to 100,000. It's very impressive for that short amount of time. But this brings us to the actual religion and the cultural reforms that the pharaoh carried out. What was this new religion? How different was it from the traditional Egyptian religion? And can it be called monotheism? As most people know, and as we've already talked about in this video, Akhenaten's entire religion revolved around the god Aten, depicted as the sun disk. But this has led to some confusion with people assuming that the god himself is the physical disk of the sun, but this isn't necessarily true. Instead, Erik Hornung and many other scholars argue that the Aten isn't actually the sun disk, but the light that the sun emits. Hornung himself writes, quote, "The Aten was not actually the sun disk, but rather the light that is in the sun, and which radiating from it calls the world to life and keeps it alive." So Atonism can essentially be said to be a religion of light, and this becomes especially clear when we read the basically only surviving text of the religion, which is the famous Great Hymn to the Aten, which is said to have been composed by the Pharaoh himself. It is a very fascinating text that is too long to quote from here, but I have made a video where I read this entire text, which you can find on my channel. In this text, the Aten is praised as the universal light which gives life to all of the world, and thus he is not a particular local god of Egypt, he is actually a universal god, which was also a very radical idea at the time. But with these basics established, what was different about this new religion? Well, for one thing, the Aten was very distant. Not only was he not depicted in any anthropomorphic ways at all, but he was also completely silent and unreachable by regular people. There was no divine revelation to follow, there was no statues to worship, and really no direct way at all for the general population to be in contact with this god. Instead, Akhenaten exalted his own position in the religion beyond what any other pharaoh had before him. Because of his inaccessibility, there were no priests of the Aten at all. There was only one priest, in fact, and that was Akhenaten himself. Akhenaten saw himself as the beloved son of the Aten, but not in the usual way that pharaohs would be the sons of gods. Akhenaten viewed himself as the son of the Aten in a much more personal way. The Aten was literally his father, and this has led some scholars to speculate just how literal this is intended to be. As we talked about in the beginning, Akhenaten's father, the previous pharaoh Amenhotep III, had begun to identify himself with the sun god at the end of his reign. And this of course raises the question, is the Aten actually the deified version of Akhenaten's literal earthly father? Is the Aten another form of Amenhotep III? It's a theory, but it's a serious one that many scholars are contemplating. In any case, Akhenaten's role in this new religion was very central and important. Since no regular person, aside from Akhenaten himself, could actually reach this god, the only way they could talk to him or worship Aten in any way was through Akhenaten. In this way, for the regular person in the city, the object of worship wasn't actually the Aten itself, but Akhenaten and his royal family. The pharaoh, along with his wife, the very famous Nefertiti, became like a divine trinity. The Aten, the single god and father, and his two divine offspring, Akhenaten and Nefertiti, all ruling together. And this is also the reason why other aspects of Egyptian society was completely reformed as well, and especially art. The art of the Amarna period, as this period of his rule is often called, is very unusual. It is unlike anything that had come before or would really come afterwards. Not only was religious art changed entirely, since none of the traditional gods were depicted anymore, and the new central god Aten had only one way of being depicted, as a sun disk with its rays reaching down to the pharaoh and his family. The way that humans were depicted changed dramatically too. The incredibly strange way that Akhenaten himself is depicted in the art of this period has been the subject of many discussions and great speculation. Whereas previous pharaohs all look pretty much the same, with an ideal kind of face and body form, Akhenaten looks, to put it simply, bizarre. This has led people to think that he may have been sick or physically deformed. Others have speculated that he was a female or even an alien, of course. In general ways, the motifs and scenes that are depicted in the Amarna period art is also very unusual and stands out to a large degree. For example, depictions of the royal family is very intimate, unusually intimate. You can see Nefertiti and Akhenaten playing with their children, being very loving and affectionate towards each other, even kissing, and this would have been completely unthinkable in previous periods. We can speculate all day as to why these radical innovations were made. Most likely it had something to do with the new religion and the fact that the royal family played an important role in this new religion. Since no regular person could reach the Aten, it was the royal family and images of the royal family that people turned to in their religious devotion. And so this is probably a very significant factor in this artistic change. So this brings us to that very central and important question. Could Akhenaten's religion be seen as monotheistic? Was Aten considered the only god in existence? There isn't actually scholarly consensus on this matter. People have different opinions and views on how much of a monotheism this actually was. But what is clear is that a few years into Akhenaten's reign, a great persecution of other gods, aside from the Aten, started to take place. These attacks were aimed primarily at the previous chief god Amun, or Amun-Ra, who suffered a serious blow during this period. Other gods other than Amun suffered as well, but with much less consistency and to a lesser degree. But statues of other gods were destroyed, names of gods were chipped away from monuments, and so in a lot of places it seems that there was an attempt to eradicate other gods that were not the Aten. This points to the idea that Akhenaten considered the Aten to be the only god that was to be worshipped. The new city that he had founded was dedicated entirely to the Aten, and in other places in Egypt, names and depictions of other gods were being destroyed. It seems like a systematic change from a polytheism to worshipping only one god. But was the Aten the only god that existed in the world, or was he the only god that was to be worshipped? There's a difference here, of course, and this is a much harder question to answer. There's also the question of how strict of a monotheism it was, since it features that kind of idea of a trinity between Aten, Akhenaten, and Nefertiti, and so there are a lot of questions here that makes this very hard to answer.
And is so accepted, not especially with the public, is about the Pharaoh Akhenaten, one of the pharaohs of the New Kingdom, and his Aten religion, and the time period of his rule known as the Amarna period, after the Wadi Amara, where he built his city. And what I hear is, he was it was like this age of Aquarius. He was a gentle pharaoh, rather than being shown fighting great battles or smiting his enemies like other pharaohs. He was shown in family moments, rather than the great sacrifices. He's shown offering flowers to the gods. He's standing under his god with his wife and his children. He was a gentle pacifist family man. He was a monotheist, one of the first monotheists to believe in only one God. And he was a forerunner, like a prophet of like Moses, and may have influenced Moses and all of that. Well, I'm here to burst a lot of those bubbles, because pretty much all of that is crap. But today on Akhenaten, I'm going to tell you basically how it really was, the real Akhenaten, and the real Atonism, and the real motives for it. Now let's get started on Akhenaten. Now, Akhenaten, of course, who was originally known as Amenhotep IV, was the son of Pharaoh Amenhotep III and his rather glamorous and very intelligent and influential mother, Queen T. Then this was in the 18th dynasty, the first dynasty of the New Kingdom, and he ruled sometime around about 1350 in that area, 1550 BCE. But to understand his great religious revolution that he attempted, first you have to understand a little bit about the Egyptian politics as well as religion, and the two are completely linked. We often try to compare present, or we reflect our own, inject our own religious ideals and mentalities on ancient religion, then that doesn't work. It's a whole different ballgame. And in ancient Egypt, religion and politics were one. This was a theocratic system by which the pharaoh was seen as the high priest, as well as a god king himself, a god himself, and by which he was worshipped, and he was the one that communed with the other gods. That was his. In fact, his job was to keep the ma'at, which it means the balance or the order between the gods, the people, and the land, and that was his whole job. Beloved of Ma'at was one of the great titles of the pharaoh. And in the original, if you go back to the Old Kingdom, the time of the pyramids, at that time period, the cult of Ra, the sun god, was dominant. Egyptian religion went through a lot of, it went through a lot of evolutions. It lasted over 3,000 years. Went through a lot of evolutions. It had a lot of different cults and groups, and certain gods were more dominant in other regions. But in the area in and around where the Pharaoh, Memphis and that area, the god Ra was the great god, and that was the god that was associated with the pharaohs. The pharaoh was the Sahra, the son of Ra, and he was a true god, worshipped as a god. He was a god king, which is one of the reasons of the symbolism of the Sphinx. The Sphinx is a great lion, which is one of the animals associated with Ra, along with the falcon, with the head of the king, showing that the king was not only a great protector, like a lion, of his pride, of his people, a great warrior and great defender of his people, but he also was his head was on an animal of the god Ra. So he was a god king on earth, and the Sphinx was a great symbol of that. That's the reason they carved that giant Sphinx between the pyramids, where they laid these god kings to rest of the Old Kingdom. And their word was absolutely unquestionable. The Pharaoh owned everything and everybody in Egypt. So, and that power was absolute. Now, by the time you got to the 18th dynasty in the New Kingdom, 1,000 years later, it was 2,000 years later, even the king was still seen as a god king, the beloved of Ma'at, and the titles were still there. Sarah, the son of Ra. Mattering on the time of the period of Egypt, and Egypt lasted a long time. Like I said, that position sometimes is more. He was seen as a king and somewhat divine. They kind of waffled on it, how much divine he was. And by the New Kingdom, that position was a little bit even questioned, a little bit. Not really questioned. It just wasn't as strongly felt as before. He was, was it just lip service? And that's the question you got to ask. But what had happened was that by the time of Akhenaten and his father Amenhotep III, the cult of Ra was not as powerful as the cult of Amun. Amun had become the prominent god. It wasn't odd for certain gods to become the prominent god of the state religion. It had changed a few times. It had been Ra in the Old Kingdom, in the Middle Kingdom. A good part of it was Montu, the god of war, and then toward the midst of the Middle Kingdom, Amun come into power. Now, Amun was one of the Ogio gods of Thebes. Originally was a god of the air, and his name basically means the unknown. But once he got a pharaoh's patronage, it became the state religion, and Amun quickly became the great god, the king of the gods, the lord of the gods, all of this. Like I said, there's a lot of mythologies and a lot of cults and groups in Egypt, but Amun was the god of the state religion. And by the time of Amenhotep III and Amenhotep IV to become Akhenaten, the cult of Amun had become very, very powerful. In fact, it's said that they owned about 25% of the lands of Egypt. and a lot of times they held very high positions in the government, because once again, there is no separation of religion and state in a theocracy, which is what the Egyptian system was. In fact, how the taxes worked in Egypt gives you a good indication. Each god had a section of land, kind of like a state, don't call it a nome or a region. And in that nome, there would be a temple to that god. And every day, every week, every month, and every year, there was a schedule of tribute to be brought to the god, offerings to be brought to God. Everything from gold to spices to cattle to grain, to livestock. All of this stuff was to be brought to the temple on a certain schedule. And as they say, what the god didn't eat or keep would be distributed out to the army, to the royalty, to the army, to the servants, to the bureaucracy. In other words, these offerings to the gods were actually the taxes of ancient Egypt. It was a temple system, and that's the way it worked. So that's how tied in that religion and politics were one in ancient Egypt. Now, one of the reasons that the cult of Amun had become very powerful and started to become a threat to the Pharaoh's power itself, you have to go back to the beginning of the 18th dynasty. Now, at the beginning of the 18th dynasty, Egypt was just coming out of what's known as the Second Intermediary Period, where the pharaonic power broke down. And Egypt had separated again. And in this case, what had happened is a group known as the Hyksos, which is a Greek word, Greek translation of an Egyptian word for basically the foreign people. This foreign group, most likely coming out of Canaan, had moved into Egypt due to a great long famine, likely the famine mentioned in the Bible. There is a stone record of this great famine that lasted several years. And Egypt is the breadbox of that part of the world, because it doesn't depend on the rains. It depends on the flooding of the rivers in Ethiopia, not in the Middle East. So, and it floods the rivers, it floods the Nile and leaves that great rich topsoil. It brings down out of the mountains, and that's what causes Egypt to live. So during times of famine in the Middle East, the Egypt, which is in Africa, bordering with the Middle Eastern countries, became the breadbox. Everybody went where the food was. And it looks like these Hyksos didn't invade and take over. They just kind of filtered in. They just kind of started coming in and eventually took over. They took over they took over Lower Egypt. And Egypt was divided once again between Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. The traditional Egyptians in Upper Egypt in Thebes, and the Hyksos running their kingdom in Lower Egypt. And this is the first time that Egypt had been divided between Upper and Lower Egypt since Narmer, the founding pharaoh of the unification of Upper Egypt 5,000 years ago. So during the late 17th dynasty of the Theban original kings of pharaohs of Egypt, they fought against the Hyksos, particularly a pharaoh named Thutmose, and he was actually killed in running them out of the country. And his brother Ahmose finished the job, kicked the Hyksos out, reunited Upper and Lower Egypt into one kingdom, once again unification, and he became the first pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, which is the start of what we call the New Kingdom. And during this time, especially with Ahmose, he was a great patron of Amun, and the cult of Amun really did become even more prominent as the state religion. Now, when it became a threat, though, came with Ahmose's granddaughter, the famous Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh. What had happened is that she had been married to her brother Thutmose the second. Her father, Thutmose I, had actually been married to Ahmose's daughter, and he had been a great pharaoh. So you had Ahmose, the great legendary founding pharaoh, and you had Thutmose the great warrior pharaoh, and she was married. She was Thutmose the first daughter, and she married her brother Thutmose II. He didn't live very long. And when he died, he didn't have he and Hatshepsut had not had a son. However, Thutmose II had a son with one of his lesser wives, and his name was Thutmose III, but he's only 5 years old. So women could not be pharaoh. In fact, there's no word for queen in ancient Egypt. Whenever we say Queen Nefertiti, Queen Nefertari, Queen T, that's our own translation of it, our own edition. It's actually most beloved wife or first wife of the pharaoh. So, in fact, the regalia, there is no word for queen. The regalia are all masculine. So, but a woman could be a regent, basically rule in the name of the true pharaoh if they were too young. And that's what Hatshepsut did. However, I guess she started figuring, hey, why should I, she got used to doing this for this 5-year-old pharaoh, and she finally was like, I'm the daughter of Thutmose I and granddaughter of Ahmose. Why shouldn't I just be pharaoh? So she had herself declared pharaoh, not only the daughter of Thutmose I, the granddaughter of Ahmose, but she was the son of Amun, the god Amun. And in fact, you can see from this stele, which actually is in the Penn Museum, it shows the Thutmose III and his stepmother and aunt ruling together. Both their names and their cartouches on each side come together in an ankh, showing that they ruled together. Interestingly, if you notice if you can see it, Hatshepsut's name has been chiseled out at a later date because they were ashamed they had a female pharaoh. But now the thing is the titles. Egyptian titles had a formula, and one of the great formulas, always is Lord of Upper and Lower Egypt, Lord of the Two Lands, Son of Ra, beloved of Ma'at, because that is the pharaoh's job. Beloved of Ma'at is always there. And if you see here with Thutmose III, on his side of it, it says, it's proper. It says beloved of Ma'at. However, if you go on the opposite side with Hatshepsut, it should say the same thing, but it doesn't. She broke the tradition and broke the ritual, and she gives the title beloved of Amun. It should be beloved of Ma'at. That's the proper formula. That's the job of the pharaoh, but she has it herself different as the beloved of Amun, because that is her propaganda showing that she was put on the throne by Amun himself. Now, it's very obvious from this that she had the backing of the cult of Amun, the high priest of Amun. And this set a dangerous precedent for the instatement of a pharaoh. Very similar to what happened with the Holy Roman Empire when the Pope crowned the emperor. Almost like he's allowing it. He is sanctifying this, making it prerequisite for the Holy Roman Emperor, to be crowned by the power of the religious authority of the Pope. Doesn't look like this is quite happening here in Egypt with the cult of Amun, but it's getting very close. She's a pharaoh with the backing of Amun and the priesthood of Amun, and this made them even more powerful and a threat to the pharaonic power. As I said, it's said that they owned about 25% of the lands of Egypt, and during Akhenaten and Amenhotep's time, they held the highest of political positions, often even being the high priest of Amun, would be the vizier, the second in command to the pharaoh. This was getting dangerous, and it was also kind of impeding on the pharaoh's divine position, the god-king position, because the cult of Amun if the cult of Amun dictated who was pharaoh, that made the god Amun and their priesthood greater than the pharaoh. So this is a power struggle. It's a little bit of a subtle one, but it is there. For instance, we start seeing a resistance from the pharaohs with the cult of Amun, going back to even Akhenaten's grandfather, Thutmose IV. Because these pharaohs wanted to get back to that the old kingdom cult of Ra. wherein the cult of Ra, the Pharaoh was an absolute god, son of Ra, unquestionable, the reigning monarch, a god king on earth, and they wanted all that back. And Amun wasn't allowing that. And Thutmose IV put up an interesting stele between the paws of the great Sphinx. He tells a story that he fell asleep, that the Sphinx at that point was buried up to the neck, up to the face. And he had a dream when he lay down to sleep there, between the paws. He had a dream that the Sphinx appeared to him as Ra-Hokati, Ra in the horizon, the great god Ra, who told him, if you all my limbs are weak from being under this sand, if you take the sand away from my limbs, you clear the sand off of me, I'll make you Pharaoh. So in other words, Ra is making me Pharaoh, not Amun. This is a religio-political move. This is a statement, and this is definitely a statement against Amun. Now, they still had to play, they are still very much playing to the state religion. You have plenty of reliefs and statues of them with the god Amun. That's part of the state religion, but they're trying to push away from it. Go back to Ra, the rather than Amun. And really, when the time you get to the Akhenaten, Amenhotep IV, his entire movement with the Aten is just one huge religio-political play on that motive, to get the pharaonic power back to the cult of Ra instead of Amun. This was a clash between the cult of the Pharaoh and the cult of Amun, and Akhenaten was determined to win this battle. His idea was just to completely override the cult of Amun with Aten. Now the thing is, the Aten is the sun disk. It is the face of the sun, and in the old now Ra was the god of the sun, and the Aten was seen as his physical manifestation, the actual disk of the sun. So really, this is a aspect of the cult of Ra, just in a more direct form with this god Aten. And to dispel one myth here is that this was a monotheistic religious movement that Akhenaten was starting. No, it's not actually monotheistic. Monotheism means that you believe in only one God and all other gods do not exist. There is only one God that exists, like we find in Islam, Judaism, Christianity. There is only one God, and all other gods do not exist. This is not what Aten was going for. And interestingly, neither was the original God of the Hebrew Bible, the old Hebrew Bible. It was the Atonism was actually a form of henotheism. Henotheism is not saying that other gods don't exist. It's just that this one is greater than the rest. Ours is greater than the rest. My dad can beat up your dad. My dog can beat up your dog. It's that type of thing. This God is greater than all the other gods, and that's really what the Atonism was about. And not only that, but even more specific, is that only the Pharaoh Akhenaten, which his name means the manifestation of the Aten, he of the body of the Aten. So he was the representative of the Aten on earth, and only he could pray to the Aten. Everybody else had to pray to him as Pharaoh. Once again, establishing that old cult of Ra, old kingdom belief of the absolute god kingness of the Pharaoh. That's what he was going for. So everybody else had to worship him, and he worshipped the Aten. And not only that, when then let's dispel something else. We see these reliefs on the walls of Akhenaten with his family, his daughters sitting on his laps, kissing his mouth, and they're playing around him and his wife, the Aten shining above them. And everybody's like, oh, what lovely family scenes, because most of the pharaohs, they showed themselves as making offerings to the gods of equal height, and they were smiting enemies with the great smiting pose, or they were riding chariots into battle. They were doing these macho, militant, kingly things. And here we have Akhenaten with, he's just worshiping the Aten above him with, it's offering him these hands, the rays coming down in hands, holding little ankhs, offering, which means life, offering life from their rays. Him worshiping with his wife Nefertiti, the beautiful Nefertiti, and whose name means she of the beautiful face, and his 6 daughters. And everybody's like, well, this shows that he was like a gentle family man and all this. No. All art in Egypt has a religious, magical, or political motive. And these Amarna period or art and these reliefs have the same type of motive. Basically, he was establishing the royal family as not only was he a god king, but his family represented the gods. The royal family, the pharaonic family, represented the gods, and these were, and in fact, one of the groups of the family of the gods was the 9 gods, the group of a family of 9 gods. They include Shu and Geb, and then Osiris, Isis, Set, Nephthys, these gods, this family of gods. Well, this family of 9 gods, known as the 9. Now, if you look at these depictions of Akhenaten and his family, there is the Aten, the god. There is the Akhenaten, his wife, and his 6 daughters. That's 9. So this is replacing the old 9 gods. The royal family are now the gods. And in fact, normally when you see the cartouche, and a cartouche always shows the name of the king, his birth name and his throne name. However, during the Aten period, the Amarna period, Akhenaten had the name of the god Aten put in a cartouche. You never see that. That links it to a king. This is a king's standard, and he is the king. He is the pharaoh. So he is the living Aten. This is another link to the state and the cult and the religion. So this whole religion definitely had a great political motive, and he did automatically. He's trying to disband the cult of Amun. He had Amun chiseled out of his father's name, Amenhotep, and Amun chiseled off the walls of a lot of temples and mortuary temples and monuments. However, it didn't work. The cult of Amun was just too powerful. In fact, excuse me, we have a lot of evidence that the cult of Amun, the cult of Aten never did completely take root. Akhenaten had built his own city called Ankhenaten, place of the Aten, out in the desert, which belonged to no other nome. It was not a nome of any other god. He moved the capital from Thebes, which guess whose nome Thebes was? Amun. He moved the capital from Thebes, the nome of Amun, to a nome that he said was dedicated to no god, dedicated to the Aten. So once again, he's getting out of their power center and establishing a new power center for the Aten and a new political center. He built this quick-made city out there. But even in this new city of Aten, archaeologists have found little statues of Horus and Anubis and Osiris and Isis and Hathor, and Bes. So even his followers hadn't given up their old gods. They were still worshiping them along with the Aten. So it really didn't change very much. And with the death of Akhenaten, it quickly the cult of Aten cult of Amun quickly moved in. Now, before we go into that, another thing that's speculated is that there was a great coup against this heretical pharaoh, who preached this one God, and all these pagan religions. We were all pagan. All these pagan priests. They plotted against and they murdered Akhenaten. We have no evidence that Akhenaten was murdered whatsoever. He actually ruled for 17 years, which that's a pretty long run, actually, or pretty little above average run for a pharaoh. Most pharaohs ruled for about 10 years. Life was a lot shorter back then. And there's no sign there was any type of coup against the pharaoh. In fact, the entire royal family, a couple of his daughters, as well as it looks like Nefertiti, around year 10 of his reign, died. His mother, Queen T, who lived there too, she died during this time period. And then finally, the pharaoh and maybe one of his sons from a lesser wife. They all seem like to have died pretty rapidly. And that was one of the things that was questions. But now it looks like there was a reason. An archaeologist, and her name's, I swear I can never remember this lady's name, it's very long. But a team of archaeologists actually did some work in Akhenaten, and they found mass graves. And in these mass graves, it was apparent that something had happened. But none of these mass graves, these burial grounds, seem to show any signs of like a massacre. No injuries, no bone injuries, no signs of violence. So they studied some of the preserved beetles and insects that were in these graves, and they found one thing in them: bubonic plague. Yeah. And in fact, it kind of matches the records, because later on, some of the Hittites actually blamed, one of the reasons they went to war with the Egyptians during the time of Akhenaten, were taking lands from him, was because that they said that when the ambassadors from Hatti had come to Akhenaten, that they had give them a great disease, give them the great plague. So, and now we have evidence of that plague. It was bubonic plague, probably broke out among the workers, but it would have spread, and that would answer why so much of the royal family died in kind of rapid succession over a couple of years. Probably took out Queen T, probably took out Nefertiti, and probably even took out the pharaoh himself. And also, that was a great piece of propaganda for the cult of Amun and everyone else that wasn't for Atonism, saying that, see, this great plague, this pestilence among them, it's a punishment of the gods for rejecting the gods. And they played that up. But either way, not long after Akhenaten died, there was a time period there of a few years where it looks like either a man named Semenkari, we're not really sure if he was Akhenaten's younger brother from one of his father's wife from one of his father's other concubines, or possibly even Akhenaten's older son. But he became pharaoh for a couple of years, but then he died, likely of the same thing. And it was after that we have the famous Aten came to the throne at the age of 9. And there's been a lot of speculation as to who Tutankhamun's father was. It's pretty much been answered now from some finds from some of the Akhenaten tabulat stones, the building stones that have been looked at, and we have found record where it says Tutankhamun was the son of Akhenaten. And that makes sense, pretty much had to be. And we now know that Tutankhamun was likely a son, not with Nefertiti, but actually with one of Akhenaten's sisters. DNA showed that Tutankhamun actually came from one of the sisters of Akhenaten. And I'll actually go over that. We found the sister's body, but we don't know which one of the daughters of pharaohs it is, which is very frustrating. This moment, we know it's one of the daughters of Amenhotep III, but we don't know which one. And she is definitely the mother of Tutankhaten. But when Tutankhamun came to the throne, the officials, the court of Amun, Tutankhaten moved the capital back to Thebes, reinstated the god Amun as the great god of the state, and he changed his name from Tutankhaten, the living image of the Aten, to Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun, and he moved the power base back to Thebes. and the cult of Amun was established. So ultimately, this great experiment of Akhenaten with the cult of the Aten, it didn't reestablish the pharaohs. It didn't take off. It didn't reestablish the pharaohs as back to the true, complete god kings that they had been in the old kingdom. And in fact, it can even be argued that it weakened the reputation and that complete divinity of the pharaonic kings from then on. It left a stain. This pharaoh had been a heretic. He was pharaoh, crowned pharaoh, but he had become a heretic. His name wasn't even to be spoken. But this god king had actually turned against the gods. He was a king. It seems to cause a certain level of disillusionment in ancient Egypt, that the pharaohs never completely shook, and ultimately, it was part of their downfall. Now, true, dear, in the 19th dynasty with the Ramesside pharaohs, Ramses the Great, Seti and Ramses the Great, the power of the pharaoh was really returned to a great golden age for a while, but the crack was still there, and that crack slowly spread out, and this disillusionment and the absolute power of the pharaoh started to spread slowly but surely. And in fact, this may answer why there may have been an insurrection against the pharaoh during the rule of Ramses the great pharaoh, Ramses II, which may have been the source of the Exodus. Remember, that is supposed to take place in this time period. So Akhenaten, the whole thing with Akhenaten may have weakened people's belief in the absolute divinity of the pharaoh, and seeing him more as just a king and not so much a god. And the cult of Amun continued to grow in power, and ultimately Akhenaten, and fear of the power of the cult of Aten was correct, because within 300 years after the 21st dynasty, the power of the pharaoh had really begun to weaken, and the power of the cult, the high priest of Amun, started to rise to the point that the high priest held more equal to more authority than the pharaoh. And finally, with the death of Ramses the 11th, the high priest Herihor actually became pharaoh. The high priest became pharaoh, and several of the pharaohs of the 21st dynasty were high priests of Amun and pharaoh. So the cult of Amun finally won. And in fact, the cult of Amun continued on even into the Greco-Egyptian period, when the Greeks associated him with Zeus. Amun was Zeus, and you got Zeus Amun, or they instead of Amun or Amun, they called him Amun. So you had Zeus Amun, but this time the Amun was associated with the ram. So you started getting depictions of Zeus with these Zeus Amun with these ram horns. And in fact, when and the great temples even built for Zeus Amun, which was visited by Alexander the Great. When Alexander the Great conquered the Persians, and then when the Persians had conquered Egypt, Alexander conquered the Persians. The Egyptians hated the Persians, loved Alexander, and when he came into Egypt, they pronounced him a god king pharaoh, and the son of Amun. The prophet of Amun, the proud priest of Amun, the oracle actually pronounced him to be the son of Amun. And in fact, in a lot of coins, Alexander the Great is shown with the horns of Amun. So, so Amun continued on. And interestingly enough, we still carry the name Amun. In Christianity, later on, Amun became a demon, of course, one of the lords of hell. But the ancient associates still come. There's a part of the hypothalamus in your brain, which comes down, and it's actually called the carnu ominous, or the horns of Amun. So we even have it in a medical term. So in the fight between the Aten and Amun definitely won. However, what can be said about Akhenaten, I don't want to completely knock it. He did try a great revolution. He did to make this great, brave power play to get the power back for the pharaoh, to try to overcome the rising power of the cult of the Amun. And his great hymn to the Aten, which is found in a lot of the tombs of for the followers of Aten of the time, is a beautiful, one of the most beautiful pieces of ancient religious literature and verse. And in fact, it looks like him even, it was used over and over again as like a template. They just changed the name of the god. It's such a pretty poem, pretty verse. They just changed the name of the god, and it was reused as a template for a lot of different pagan gods. And in fact, it looks like it was so popular that it even made it into the Bible. There's a big similarity between the verses of Psalm 104 and the hymn of the Aten. If you look at the two compared, it looks like there's definitely some influence there. That this rather popular pagan hymn to the gods, to a god, was so popular that it was re-edited as a prayer to Yahweh and made it into the Psalms in the Bible. So Akhenaten left a little bit of his legacy, and he still has to be admired for this great, not only religious attempt but political attempt to take back power for the pharaoh. Well, okay, folks, that's all I've got on Akhenaten. I hate if I've disillusioned some people out there, kind of burst some romantic bubbles about, an idealistic bubbles about Akhenaten, and his religious cult of the Aten. But in truth, this was much more of a political move than some sort of religious revelation.
Make it perfect.